All right, thank you all very much for joining us for our second public event. So this is Persuasion. We're a new publication and community devoted to fighting for the values of a free society. We are animated by three basic founding principles. The first is that we seek to create societies around the world in which all individuals are free to pursue a meaningful, dignified life irrespective of who they are. The second is that we deeply believe in the social value of persuasion and therefore want to defend free speech and free inquiry against any of its enemies. And the third is that we're animated by a spirit of persuasion. And part of the spirit of persuasion is that we actually want to convince and persuade those who disagree with us rather than mocking or trolling them. So if you're following this along on YouTube and you're interested in getting the wonderful articles that we're publishing, just in the next week, we're going to have articles from Emily Yoffe and Gary Kasparov, from myself and many other great contributors. Please go to www.persuasion.community in order to sign up. And if you want to be part of these conversations, if you want to join the Zoom call rather than following this along on YouTube and be able to ask questions and then discuss afterwards with like-minded people in these small groups, please become a paying subscriber and join up in that way as well. All right, so it was very important to me that early on we would have a debate about one of the most important issues of the day. And that is to think about the threats to the free society, not just in countries like the United States, but around the world. I'm deeply convinced that we will only be able successfully to fight for the values of a free society if those values will hold the universal appeal and realize the universal appeal in countries around the world. And so our wonderful board of advisors has some of the most distinguished thinkers and intellectuals from virtually every continent in the world. And I'm very, very pleased and privileged that three of them are joining us today. So we have Denise Dresser, one of the most distinguished journalists and commentators based in Mexico with a very good understanding of Latin, Central and South America. We have Ivan Krastev, to my mind, the most important Central European intellectual. And Ivan, as I once wrote in a review, people always are always puzzled by this claim. They always misunderstand it a little bit. But I once wrote in a review, and I think that is true, that you are what Slavoj Žižek pretends to be, which is to say that Žižek pretends to be deep and insightful with his paradoxical observations that are deeply revelatory of the world. I personally think that he does none of those things, but you actually do. And finally, Pratap Bhanu Mehta, really the foremost commentator on Indian politics and also a great political theorist who has a great understanding of the genealogy and the issues facing us when we think about liberal values. So welcome to you all. And I guess I want to ask each of you a little bit about, what you think about the prospects for liberalism around the world. And perhaps you can say a word or two about the prospects in your region, but I don't want to sort of limit you to your regions. So, based on your experience of particular parts of the world, do you think that the 21st century is likely to move towards a greater realizations of the value of a free society? Or do you think that that is a naive and perhaps overly hopeful way of thinking about it, that those values are perhaps more parochial, more based just in the traditional Western heartlands of liberal democracy than people like me would like to think? Why don't we start just in alphabetical order and start with you, Denise?
Well, I'm going to speak from the experience of my region. As you mentioned, I hail from Mexico. And I think that what's happening here and what I see happening throughout the region is very illustrative of a quite deep problem that we're facing. And that's the fact that when the transitions to democracy occurred in the 1980s in many countries, and which were celebrated for the aspiration of liberal values after decades of military rule or other variants of authoritarianism, the transitions were largely successful in electoral ways. We saw a competition between parties, we saw a rotation of elites, but I think now when we're seeing populist backlashes in many countries like Brazil and like Mexico, the sad realization is that our transitions were truncated, were incomplete, and that we ended up in many cases with illiberal democracies, with democracies that presented themselves as liberal, but in reality were not, with governments that constantly violated constitutional rights, threatened the rights of minorities, broke the barriers between church and state. And the fact that liberal democracy remained an aspiration and not a reality for many people, coupled with what began to become an accentuated trend in the region, which was greater economic inequality, and the fact that many sectors of the population felt underrepresented. I mean, for years in Latin America, in my country specifically, we've been living with a crisis of representation, with dysfunctional democracies that were plagued by corruption, that were plagued by the fact that a technocratic elite tried to promote neoliberal economic policies, but left too many people behind. So what you started to see was, and the polls throughout the region reflected this, was a disappointment with democracy. And so now the trend, the emerging trend in many countries is what William Galston calls an illiberal democratic response to undemocratic liberalism. So I'd say the future of liberalism in Latin America is going through a very rough time right now because it was never fully realized. And to defend the values of liberalism when we've never truly embodied them in regimes across the region becomes very difficult, particularly when espousing the language of liberalism vis-a-vis the language of populism, which appeals to emotion, which appeals to grievances, which appeals to anti-establishment politicians, and is anti-elitist in its language. What populist leaders are doing in my country, for example, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, is saying, we're the real Democrats. All of you who fought for liberal democracy, that democracy that you espoused and promoted was not truly democratic. And we are the real liberals, and you are the conservatives because you're defending a regime that benefited the elites, that benefited technocrats, that benefited monopolists and plutocrats. So it becomes difficult in terms of the language and the narrative, and also in terms of political organization by the opposition to oppose populist leaders, to present yourself as a liberal Democrat, because you will be accused of representing the old regime, the ancien regime that was not fully democratic, for people who left behind, who felt left behind, for the millions who never escaped from poverty, for those who now are conscious of the growing concentration of wealth that the region has undergone in the last 30 years. So it's difficult to promote the values of liberalism in a region that never fully experienced liberalism, and that now liberalism has become sort of a dirty word. And I never thought I'd live in a country where basic concepts like checks and balances, freedom of the press, civil society became sort of contested living in a country and in a region where many of those things that we took for granted and believed were positive are now being presented by populist leaders as antithetical to democracy. Whereas people like López Obrador and Bolsonaro say that they are the true Democrats, and that the liberal Democrats of the past, because they were actually illiberal, do not fully represent the people, and that's not the direction that we should be headed in. So as I go back to my basic point, I think that we're facing dark times for liberalism in Latin America.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is obviously particularly relevant to Latin America, but it's a wider point that's important to me as we build this community, which is that the values of a free society, the values of philosophical liberalism, to me, do hold the key to building better societies and a better future in countries around the world. But we can never pretend that this is simply a matter of returning to some golden age or of preserving the status quo, because in different ways, in different parts of the world, liberal values have never been fully realized. And so the nature of this movement has to be a progressive one. It has to be to aspire to a fuller realization of the values which we've sort of put in our banner in the first place. And you're right that a lot of the resistance against it comes from the fact that people feel like actually, people have talked about those values, but they haven't realized them. So why should we trust that? Ivan, I feel like that speaks to your concerns and your region of the world as well.
Oh, it's true. Basically, in Central and Eastern Europe, even more than in Latin America, liberalism is the old regime. Because after 1989, this was the liberal consensus, which was endorsed by everybody. And in a certain way, the liberalism became the victim of its own victory and monopoly also over political discourse. Everybody was trying to call themselves liberals in the 1990s. And this creates, in my view, particularly in the case of Central and Eastern Europe, this crisis of liberal democracy basically has three different sources. One is, and this is quite important, in Central and Eastern Europe, liberalism was not perceived as a specific ideology or basically a set of institutions. It was another name for the West. So after 1989, the idea was we want to be like the West. We want to imitate the West. We want to integrate in the West. And one of the first levels of resistance came from the fact that, listen, imitating is the way we learn many things, but perceiving yourself as an imitator is not highly inspiring. So many of the populist parties basically came with the message, we don't want to imitate anymore. But secondly, and this is very important for Central and Eastern Europe, we start to fear that the model that we have been imitating is in crisis too. Listen, in places like Bulgaria or even Poland, when you have a major political scandal, people normally is going to say this could never happen in the United States or the United Kingdom. And you cannot say this anymore. And then the third story is that, of course, you have the generational dimension of this, which is very important. East European liberalism was very much rooted in the rejection of the communist experience, which was very kind of critical in several respects. Because communism was about public property, in Central and Eastern Europe, we have a kind of adoration of the private property. And in a certain way, neoliberalism was much more endorsed. And of course, the freedom of speech, certain things that you have been lacking before were critically important. For the younger generation, these things are taken for granted. And what is happening, and this is interesting to see particularly in places like Poland and Hungary, what is a liberalism is now going to be defined by the opponents, by the enemies of liberalism. And I do believe this is the interesting story. Exactly, and I very much agree with Denise. The liberals are in a difficult position. On one level, you try to defend some basic principles, but on the other side, you also want to be critical enough because many of the things that happened in the last 30 years, liberals themselves don't like. But you don't know how to do both of them. You don't know how basically to try to reinvent liberalism without basically being afraid that any type of a critical voice and that are we too self-critical and so on and so on. And you have this. On the other side, and I do believe that, and this is where I'm going to end this, you are going to see Because the problem of rights, individual rights and others, are deeply embedded in the way people understand life. So from this point of view, I'm not afraid that liberalism is going to disappear. In Central and Eastern Europe these days, you have a new kind of a liberalism, which is very much the reaction to the rise and the governing experience of the populist parties. You can see this in Poland, you can see this in Slovakia, where basically this kind of a new generation of liberals, they do not speak English language. They probably are not using the same keywords, but they start to realize, based on their own experience, that concentration of power is bad. That the fact that somebody claimed that they're the true Bulgarians or the true Poles and all others are just traitors is not how it works. So from this point of view, I'm not afraid that liberalism basically is doomed in the 21st century, but I agree with you, Yasha. They should be rethinking and reconception what it means to be a liberal in a world in which not a classical authoritarianism is the major issue. For example, it's not the conformity towards the state. It is much more the conformity towards your own peer group and your own community that is becoming one of the major challenges. And this is kind of, particularly for Central and Eastern Europe, I do believe this is a kind of a new generation of questions.
You know, I think that's a really interesting observation, that the experience of governments that violate basic liberal principles in extreme ways turns people into liberals. And they may not use that language initially. They may not have liked ideas of liberalism before they experience its demise. But that tracks, I think, the historical evolution of liberalism, which is not that anybody ever came up and said, you know what, the most ambitious, perfectionist idea for how to create a wonderful society is to institute all of those values. It's through the very horrible lived experience of religious wars, of genocide, of civil war, of political oppression, of corrupt dictators, of corrupt monarchs, that liberalism arose over the period of decades and centuries. And by the way, just to bring it back for one moment to the United States, I think that's one of the things that should make those of us who are worried about growing a liberalism in this country quite optimistic in that respect. I think the more a certain kind of illiberalism, including from the left, takes over and actually influences political institutions, influences universities, influences workplaces, the more there's going to be pushback against some of those things. And we've started to see that in the last weeks and months. So, you know, I take both you, Ivan, and Denise to be aware of the deep challenges to liberalism at this point. But there's an optimistic note at the end there that Ivan brought us. Pratap, are you more optimistic or pessimistic looking at it from a perspective of a society that, for all of its own problems and challenges, seems to be veering quite rapidly away from liberalism at this point?
Okay, so I'll build on what Denise and Ivan said, but maybe take a slightly different track, because I mean, I think Ivan is right that, you know, at one level, many of the claims of liberalism, right, the expansion of rights, assertions for demands for recognition and equality, those are actually permeating common politics, right? I mean, think of the expansion of, you know, LGBT rights, think of expansion of discourse on racial equality, various kinds of things across the world. To my mind, I think the single biggest challenge to liberalism right now is, I think, the ideology that has always been its Achilles heel throughout its history since the middle of the 19th century, and that's nationalism, right? Liberalism is a theory of rights. It's never had a theory of membership. Who counts as a member of this community? And if you look at the most profound sources of illiberalism across the world, but particularly in a country like India, it comes from that simple word nationalism, right? So if you're part of the majority Hindu community, you're actually doing okay. I mean, you know, you're less threatened than minorities would be. And nationalism puts two things on the table that are very challenging for liberalism, right? One is, of course, a kind of Manichaean worldview. Liberalism is an ideology of compromises. It's an ideology of moderation. nationalism at some point does say who's the friend and who's the enemy, who's the insider and who's the outsider, whether it's defined by white supremacy, whether it's defined by Hindu majoritarianism. And I think almost all the countries in the region are struggling with that definition and redefinition of what is nationalism, who counts as a member of this community, and what are the terms of that membership. Right? Are the terms of the membership going to be benchmarked by an identification with an ethnic majority, or are the terms going to be benchmarked by something else? Right? So in that sense, nationalism has in a sense been that shadow to liberalism since the 19th century. I mean, let's not forget, right, the rise of the nation state, nationalism in middle of the 19th century. That was the source that often led to exclusion of minorities, homogenization of culture, ethnic cleansing, those kinds of things. So insofar as nationalism is ascendant, certain sort of aggressive kind of nationalism, I think that is in the end still going to be the biggest challenge to liberalism, because nationalism can, in a sense, it aims at the capture of state power and uses state power to define the terms of membership, in a way in which I don't think the contemporary cultural left does. I mean, I think that's more a kind of argument for the realm of culture, civil society, universities. But nationalists really do believe, right, in converting every Indian into a particular kind, I think of India. And insofar as, if you see global trends, right, I think partly in response to the rise of China, partly in response to authoritarianism in China, but also autonomously, there seems to be a reversion back or a greater legitimacy for majority nationalisms across the world. I think insofar as that is a powerful force, I think liberalism will remain fragile. But the optimistic story is that battle has been around since the middle of the 19th century. And the question is, will there be enough countervailing forces that if there is a greater push towards cultural homogenization or defining the terms of membership in terms that are too exclusionary, then you're going to actually get a backlash. Right now in India, this is just last remark I'll end with, I do think over the next 3 to 5 years, the future does look bleak. Because the classic checks and balances that Indian society had counted on, with all its imperfections, we did have functioning institutions like the Supreme Court of India, which is one of the most powerful courts in the world. Those are more or less on the verge of collapsing, or you might say elites abdicating their role. For the first time, I think in modern Indian history, you do not have the kind of fragmentation of power across class, caste, and region that always acted as a kind of natural break, as it were, on the concentration of power. And the third thing, finally, which Ivan said, which is very important, which is I think the difficulty liberals are having dissociating themselves with the previous corrupt ancient regimes. So the revulsion is against so-called liberals, and it's like the revolt against the church, right? I mean, in the 18th century. You take down religion with it because you don't like the church, or you find the church corrupt. But what I don't see happening, and that's to me the biggest worry, and this is the big irony, the right and the nationalists have mastered modern political vocabularies quite well in this respect. They are constructivists about identity, despite all the talk of essentialism. They are going out and mobilizing people, right? Narendra Modi created a new form of nationalism by saying, I will not take the sociological determinism of caste and class and region for granted. Right? Liberals, as much as we talk about being constructivists about identity, our politics is actually sociologically very overdetermined. We are still waiting for the right ethnic coalition. We are still waiting for the right class coalition, whereas the right has just, mastered the tools of propaganda, mastered modern social media, modern political languages to actually unsettle these sociological determinisms and try and create something overpowering. And I think we'll have to get out of that mental laziness in order to combat nationalism.
That's very interesting. I mean, the much mocked statement by Dick Cheney that the problem with the left is part of a reality-based community, whereas the Bush administration is trying to reset reality, I think has a lot of pitfalls. And obviously, the conflict, the Iraq War to which it was applied, turned out not to be quite as susceptible to reality making as the Bush administration had apparently believed. But it seems to capture something similar, that one of the talents of the right in this political moment is to actually recast reality in a way that suits it, whereas perhaps liberals and in a slightly different note, the left takes the sociological facts for granted. I mean, Ivan, one of the observations of yours that has really influenced me in the last few years is this idea that in 1989, we looked at the revolutions in the former Soviet Union and in Central Europe. And what we thought we saw was a bunch of people fighting for liberal values, fighting for individual freedom and self-determination. But actually, looking back at it, it's clear that there was a big mix of motivations for people, and probably the nationalist element was much stronger and has been much stronger all along than it has ever been. And when we were together at an event in Prague to commemorate the 30th anniversary of their revolution, you saw this split, all these different participants in the revolution of 1989, from Václav Havel's brother. Václav Havel himself, of course, passed away, to Václav Klaus, the successor of Havel as president, were now completely on different sides. And from our point of view, it's tempting to say, well, one side of this represents the true spirit of a revolution, and the other side represents traitors to the revolution. But Ivan, I take it that your perspective would be that actually there are different strands of a revolution, and we have to recognize that. So is it possible to turn these countries in Central Europe and other parts of the world that have real reason to be nationalist, that have experienced foreign occupation in ways that give them strong reason to be wary of foreign influences in their country? Is it possible to have a form of nationalism, to construct a new form of nationalism in those countries that is truly liberal? Or do you think that nationalism and liberalism will always be at odds, and perhaps that nationalism will end up winning out?
So historically, at least in Europe, nationalism and liberalism came as an allies. Yeah. They didn't came up as an opponents. And both Central and Eastern Europe, particularly in the last decade, after Orban won, after the Law and Justice Party in Poland won, people start saying where basically the nationalism, why it returned, where it came from. But the truth is that it was never disappeared. It was much more interesting to see where it has been hiding and why. First of all, the nationalist was a very important element of the anti-communist revolutions of 1989. It's enough to read any book about the solidarity that was written before 1989 to know that it was a very, very strong trend. And for example, somebody like Mr. Kaczynski did not change very much his views from 1989. But at this moment, the liberals and the nationalists, they have a common goal. And one was the sovereignty of Poland and basically joining the West. And also what happened with the nationalistic discourse in Europe, and this is something that particularly we East Europeans were very much kind of slow to notice the importance of these events, was that it was the war in Yugoslavia that for a while deprived the nationalists of a language. Because in the 1990s, nationalism was associated with Milosevic and the ex-communists. So for people like Mr. Kaczynski, who basically was believing in sovereignty and nationalism and so on, he could not see himself as the ally of Milosevic because basically they have a very different political biographies. So at the moment when the nationalists believed that they achieved their geopolitical goals, namely their countries got sovereign, they joined the West, then this kind of a nationalism came. And of course, this was also the result of the fact that the problem of the national community is also quite important in Central and Eastern Europe because of the two important cultural things that I do believe we also kind of underestimated. One is people are saying that in Europe in general for the last decade, the last century, 20th century, people has been moving a lot. But do you know what? They were moving, but as a result of it, you're ending up with more and more homogeneous ethnic communities. So you have a movement of people that was not producing kind of a multi-ethnic society, but basically was a dismantling multi-ethnic societies. In 1939, 1/3 of the population of Poland were not ethnic Poles. There was Jews, there were Germans, there were Ukrainians. In 1989, 95% of the population of Poland were ethnic Poles. And also communist authorities have been using ethnic homogeneity as the way to legitimize their powers, particularly after the communist ideology started to fade away. So this type of ethnically homogeneous societies now are facing totally different reality. We have a movement of people, but this movement of people are making our societies much more diverse everywhere. And secondly, in Central and Eastern Europe, one of the successes of the end of communism was opening of the borders and a lot of Central and East Europeans leaving the countries. We are talking a lot about the problem of migration in the Western Europe, but one of the major things that happened in Central and Eastern Europe was that up to 15% of the population has left. Working in the Western Europe or going to the United States, and it's mainly younger people. So you have this combination between aging societies, because Eastern Europe is one of the most aging parts of the world, and the younger people living. And this created this demographic fear in Central and Eastern Europe, which was very much utilized by the populist leaders. So I do believe this is interesting. On the other side, on the positive side, talking about nationalism and the nature of nationalism. For example, there was a major kind of a crisis and rise of nationalism in the region as a result of the refugee crisis of 2015. And many of the West European countries were basically shocked because in Central and Eastern Europe, there was a very strong anti-refugee consensus, but there were no refugees. There were simply no refugees. The refugees were in Sweden and in Germany. It was very interesting to see a totally different type of nationalism that came with the COVID-19 crisis. States closed their borders overnight, everybody, nationalists and non-nationalists, Germans and Hungarians. But this was a different type of nationalism. It was not by origin, it was by residence. Paradoxically, during the ethnic crisis, you're Bulgarian, and nevertheless, where you are, this is what matters for the national community. During the COVID-19, people were much more tolerant and much more inclusive when it comes to foreigners or migrants that happened to be in the country when the country was closed. And they were not very eager for their own to come back and bring the infection with them. I'm saying this because it's very important also to try to distinguish between different types of nationalisms, how it works, how they are defined. The ethnic nationalism that we see in places, or religious nationalism that we see in places like India and in some of our countries, is very different to a much more civic constitutional nationalism that try to include, that try to say political community is important and nationalism is important to democracy because of a very simple reason. The person, the other citizen, is very important for you because you agreed to govern yourself together. And I do believe this kind of idea of the citizenship opposed to the ethnic belonging is critical. And at some point, probably particularly in Europe, because of the European Union and others, liberalism was identified with a kind of a radical form of anti-nationalism, also because of the Yugoslav wars. And then basically all these populists jumped in and said, they don't care about national community. They don't care about anybody because they're the winners of the transition, because they're mobile, because they can choose this and that. But now people start to understand that just speaking in kind of a violent nationalistic terms is also not what people really like. One of the paradox, Poland from this point of view is a great example, because of course the opposition lost the last presidential elections, winning almost 50% of the vote. But the candidate of the opposition is the most liberal person ever running on the elections in Poland, on every issue, on cultural issues, on social issues. And I do believe this kind of a paradox should be kept in mind. It's not that the world is moving in one direction. I don't believe that basically the populists are going to inherit the earth.
Right. I think that's wonderfully put. But just a question for you. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. You know that in a sense, both liberalism and nationalism were also joined together, and particularly nationalism and democracy. But I guess here's the question, right? If you look at globally, and many would argue this is the case in the United States as well, I mean, and sometimes the distinction between civic nationalisms and ethnic nationalisms can be overstated, that even in countries with strong constitutional traditions and which are strong constitutional democracies, this particular anxiety that the cultural character of those societies will somehow be lost, either to multiculturalism, either to immigration, in India's case, to minorities, right? That anxiety in some senses, right, which is very manifest in Trump's politics, certainly taps into a strain, right? That anxiety certainly seems to be very visible in Europe in different sections. I agree with you. It's not the case that that ideology will have unchallenged momentum. Nevertheless, that anxiety seems to be very, very widespread.
Yeah.
And yes, it's true that, you know, I agree with you. I mean, COVID has given all of us a pause in some ways. On the other hand, it could also resume very fast, very, very quickly. And to that extent, I'm worried that I don't think the conventional distinction between civic nationalism and ethnic nationalism, at least understood in the terms of the formal constitutional structure of the society, is enough to, in a sense, tap into or answer this particular anxiety. And, you know, this is a poison. It doesn't take a lot of people to use this poison, actually put a pressure on liberal values. I mean, you know, you can imagine electorally defeating populism, right? But if forms of majoritarian anxiety nevertheless permeate civil society, nevertheless permeate civil society organizations, religious organizations, it can constantly produce a polarizing kind of politics. And polls may be getting sharper. So I think that was the worry.
No, this is a great point. And to be absolutely honest, what really bothers me is not the rise of a certain political parties, because they're political cycles. Listen, you can never govern all the time. The problem is that this kind of a Schmittian understanding of politics, which is friends and enemies, it's a zero-sum game, which is critically important. And this is where basically the populist has the major success, because if you go to the opinion polls in places like Poland, you're going to see that the majority of people really respect the rule of law. They do believe that democracy is fine, that there should be separation of powers, but then they're not ready to punish on the election day their own leaders when they violate them. And then you're asking why. And they said, yes, of course, this is a problem for democracy, but the real problem for democracy is if the other party is going to win. And we had something that with Stephen Holmes, we have been very much trying to call, you used to have a democracy of citizens, and citizens tend to be critical towards their own political parties, towards their own political leaders, and they were proud of this. For example, being a liberal quite often means to be very critical for the existing liberal parties in your own country. In this type of a polarized politics, democracy of citizens is replaced by the democracy of citizen offense. Basically, the voter starts to behave like a fans of football clubs. And from this point of view, you're not looking for representation, and you're not allowed to criticize your own.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in here, because I think that one of the major challenges for the future of liberalism is that something we haven't discussed here, which is identity politics and the re-signification of what it means to be a citizen. Because what we're seeing in countries like my own is that there's an emergent tribal feeling, sentiment that is being created by populist leaders that defines people in terms of their allegiance to a movement, to a leader, to a sentiment, and not necessarily to a political party. And it re-signifies what it means to belong to a political community. Because now the people who are right, who are appropriate, who are who are part of the political movement are members of the pueblo, of the people. And populist leaders don't use the term citizen. So it's in a political debate of the sort of which I form part constantly. People like me are being told that we're not part of the people. And I insist, well, excuse me, the last time I read the Constitution, I was part of we the people as well, and I am a citizen. But when you use that sort of language, the language of citizenship and the language of rights, it's like running into a brick wall at this moment in time because of the resignification of the concept and the way in which the concept of people is being used to oppose the concept of citizenship. And going back to something interesting that one of you said earlier, that the problem for many of weaker democracies with weak party systems in Latin America is that the shining city on the hill, the example, which was the United States, as you said, is in crisis. So suddenly we see Trump using identity politics, polarizing, lambasting elites, even though he's part of them, and using even nationalist and I'd even say white supremacist language in order to rally his base. What you're seeing in Latin America is leaders emulating him in the way in which he takes on the press, disparages the media, disparages opposition parties, believes that liberalism is a dead concept that isn't representative of the people who've been left behind. And one thing I'd like to incorporate into this debate is that the future of liberalism is inextricably linked first to depolarizing, to creating consensus, to persuading, to recovering the concept of citizenship, but also it's linked to what liberals can propose economically. Because one of the Achilles heels of liberal democracy, or the language of liberal democracy, or the future of parties that espouse liberal values, is what are they going to offer economically to people? And I think that we have to incorporate that in how we think about liberalism, because liberalism today is associated with inequality, with concentration of wealth, with monopolies. And I think that opposition parties, if they want to regain space that they've lost, have to address those issues in terms of what is government going to do differently that it didn't do in the past when it was allegedly liberal. And I think this entails just basic public policies that are now being debated globally, such as taxing the rich, such as universal basic income, such as regulation over monopolies, promoting competition, defending consumers, and trying to bridge the gap between the haves and the have-nots. So I think that when we think about the future of liberalism, it's important, yes, to talk about the impact of nationalism, how we think about citizenship, but there is an economic element that is, I think, inextricably linked to inequality. It explains the current backlash against liberalism and that we need to take into account.
So I think Denise raises two really important issues here. One is this economic question, and that's something that I think we should really debate as part of persuasion going forward, which is that on the one hand, globalization has actually had tremendous benefits to people around the world. And in a very interesting and under-heralded development, Branko Milanovic, who came up with a famous elephant curve, which seemed to show that a lot of the poor in the world were benefiting from globalization, a lot of the very rich were benefiting from globalization, sort of the trunk of the elephant, but a lot of the people in the middle and the upper middle are not. Recently published an update to the elephant curve, which covers 5 more years of data. And it turns out that this is no longer the case, that actually all groups are benefiting quite a lot and the poorest are benefiting the most. So I think there's elements of our economic order that those of us who care not just about the values of a free society, but those of us who care about ensuring that people have stable water and electricity and access to education and so on, should defend. But at the same time, it is obviously true that within countries, inequality is often rising, but not as much of the economic growth goes to ordinary people as we might hope, and that we need real economic reforms on that. I think we can have, as liberals, as defenders of free society, a broad variety of views about exactly what policies are needed for that, but we need to have a serious conversation about that, and that's certainly part of what I hope to do in this community. Now, the other point you made, I think, was slightly in tension with what both Ivan and Pratap were saying in different ways, and I think it's interesting to highlight that, which is that there is a liberal counter movement to these populists. I think Ivan is right that you're seeing in Poland both the victory of the populists in a way that's very scary for a political system there, but also the growth of a set of liberals, or a cohort of liberals who are saying, we are seeing in practice what this is doing to our country and we want to oppose it. And that cohort is 49%, not 50, but 49. That's very significant. Now, there's an optimistic way of reading that, but the pessimistic way is that Poland is now a more deeply divided society than even before. And even though there's a cohort of people who really believe in those liberal values, it has been politicized to such an extent that the idea that we could ever agree on a set of common rules and institutions that actually mediate this political dissent is perhaps more remote than ever. Because unless this 49% grow to be 80 or 90%, the things they believe in have been politicized to such an extent that they cannot form the operating system or political system the kind of way we need in order to be able to actually negotiate about policy and negotiate about cultural issues or social issues in a way that stays true to the system. So what I'd love to do is two things. First, I would love to get a couple of questions in at the end. So if you're interested in asking a question, please feel free to go to the participants panel and raise your hand. But before we do that, I would love a last round of go-abouts, and perhaps we'll go in reverse order this time, just to hear from all of you, what should we actually be doing? We have, I think, the deepest analysis of the challenges facing liberalism around the globe that I've heard in the last years in this very concentrated time. We haven't heard as much about what we should actually be doing. So what can those of us who are members of this community who want to defend free values, what can governments, what can non-government organizations around the world do to actually stand up for these ideas? Let's start with you, Pratap, and then we'll go to Ivan and that.
Okay. I think 2 quick points because we're running out of time and maybe you can discuss them in questions later. One, I think Denise is absolutely spot on that liberals do need an economic agenda, and an economic agenda that isn't simply a restoration of some status quo or Gramscian regime. I think we've been too easily identified with plutocracy and privatization. And particularly at this point in the post-COVID crisis, where the need for reclaiming public goods, I think for liberals is actually very, very strong. Having said that, though, I do think there is one thing which I frankly just don't understand. I think there's just a perplexity, and maybe we can work out, which is that, we are in a time of political discourse where there is this great sort of asymmetry between truth and suspicion. And all that you have to do to defeat liberals is cast doubt on their credibility. Whereas for the right, the standard is different, right? And is there something about the structure of discourse, the way in which social media has transformed sort of political argument, the nature of political argument, that in fact, you might say a presumption of suspicion, right? I think hangs over all of us in a way in which we haven't learned how to combat through argument. What are strategies of engagement, let's say with social media, with communication, that are actually appropriate to this particular moment, so that we are not fighting, as it were, on the authoritarian's wicket, as it were. I think that's in a sense just a question, but I don't think in the end there is any go around but to do old-fashioned organization, liberals have to become the insurgent group once again in some ways, right? I think we were victims of our own success.
And part of this is definitely the spirit of persuasion, but I think we need to, we had the sense of malaise, but we used to be the establishment and we're no longer the establishment and we should sort of sit there and suffer quietly. Part of my theory of change, at least within the United States, is that we need to become an energetic, rebellious counter-establishment movement, a counter-ideological movement, in the way that some other ideological streams have done in the last decades. And they've been very successful at that. So let's embrace this more oppositional spirit, and I think that can re-energize us, make us think harder, and so on. So I think that's relevant in many different contexts. Ivan.
So first, one historical remark. If you see people that have been called liberals and that basically define themselves as liberals in the history of France in the 19th century, you're going to see two types of people. Either people, part of the establishment of the old regime, that have been advocating reforms, fearing the revolutions, or people that have been part of the revolutions and get disappointed with it. As a Benjamin Constant. So the moment when you have this kind of a revolutionary mobilization, liberals were not doing very well because the idea of complexity, nuances, and so on is not what governs people in the moment of a kind of a revolutionary fever. But for me, there is one big problem of the 1990s that should be challenged. The major answer to all the problems, economic issues, inequalities, and so on, which was coming out of the 1990s was education. I remember basically when the debate between the Conservatives and the Labour Party in UK, and when the Blair said that his three priorities are education, 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 his Conservative counterpart, he said, okay, I am for the same three, but not in the same order. Why I'm saying this? In a certain way, what you can see in the West is certain kind of a disappointment of the promise of education. Look at the young Spaniards or Italians that went to the university. They got a university education, but they cannot get jobs. I had the support from the dog on this. So from this point of view, there was the idea that before it was, if you're going to go to university, if you're going basically to study, if you're going to have an education, it's going to be fine. You're going to get better social chances. You're going to get better social promotions. And of course, this is still true for the best universities in the world, but this is not true for the whole universities. And I'm very much afraid that it's not possible anymore just for the liberals to say the education is the answer to all of the problems of inequalities and basically economic developments that we have. So my ally came into the picture.
We have a simple rule here at Persuasion, which I established in the last meeting, which is nobody needs to be ashamed of any child or dog making noise in the background. But if they do, you have to show them to us. So thank you, Denise, for showing this lovely dog to us, and take it away. Oh, sorry, Denise, I'd put you on mute for a minute while the dog was barking. Let's see. Now you should be being unmuted. This is not working for some reason. Let's give me 1 second here.
How's that?
Yes, perfect. That's working.
Excellent. I'm sorry for the interruption of the dog, but her name is Sol, which means sun. So there's some hope for the world yet. Just to finish, I think that given the current context, liberals have to be the resistance and admit that that's what we are doing, and underscore the authoritarian nature of regimes that are being put into place. I loved it when one of you said that the current situation is turning people who didn't perceive themselves as liberals into liberals, and as a result of that, populists will not inherit the earth. And I think the way in which to be resistant to what is happening is to underscore what is being lost. That may have been imperfect, that may have been dysfunctional, but that certainly is better than the future that lies ahead, for example, for a country like Mexico or for Brazil. Because illiberal movements, populist movements that are taking over are taking away public goods from many sectors of society, particularly the middle classes. So I think that as members of the resistance, we have to point out what is being lost in terms of health, education, social mobility, inclusivity. I think we need to speak a great deal about the benefits of economic, cultural, political openness versus closure. We need to point out what happens to a society when you start to lose freedom of the press, when rule of law is undermined even further by caudillo, by strongmen politics. What happens to the rights of minorities when they are even more marginalized? And I think the middle classes are going to play an important role in the future when they start to realize that they're witnessing a return to everything that they fought against in the past. Discretionary presidentialism, lack of transparency in lack of rule of law regarding contracts, the way in which investors are being ostracized or being scared off by this constant change in the rules of the game as a result of nationalist economic policies. And I think that the resistance also needs to emphasize the values of citizenship and the importance of citizenship over tribalism, and why it is that the concentration of powers in authoritarian populists of the right or of the left are so bad for let me use the word bourgeoisie in the Barrington Moore sense. And remember that famous phrase of his book, that no bourgeoisie, no democracy. And I think if we start to believe that the middle classes are going to really be the ones that lose out in the current and future context, at least in the short run, that's where the focus of resistance and I think that the political and intellectual responses can come from.
Wonderful. Well, that was an amazing debate. I want to make sure that we hear from some of the people who are members of our community. Let's go first to Trevor. Trevor, go ahead.
Hi, Yasha, and thank you and everyone for participating. This has been a great discussion. Professor Dresser, I think you've been hitting on what I've been thinking about this entire hour, is the disconnect between our values and principles and our sort of theory of rights, as Mr. Mehta described liberalism, and the material well-being of a lot of people in our societies. And I think what you see on the left is that they are targeting, are perceiving things and looking at things in terms of power. Because even if you look at a sort of democratic system where you have the left and the right who have equal access to policy debates, well, at the end of the day, if in the United States Democrats pass a sort of economic bill that helps most people, the real power in our society still resides in the hands of those with economic power. And so there seems to be a disconnect between what liberalism in terms of principles and values can deliver for people's material well-being. I'm wondering if you can comment more about how we can actually build a better connection between those two things.
Well, the real question is, how much are economics willing to give up in order to assure a freer, more equal, more liberal society? And what we're seeing right now in the first years of Trump, and you're seeing it in Mexico and other places in Latin America, is that wealthy elites initially tend to side with whoever is going to deliver economic benefits for them in the short term. So you saw many wealthy donors supporting Trump because he helped their agenda in terms of deregulation, in terms of certain sectors of the economy that, big pharma, the oil industry, carbon, etc. But the losers are going to be those who benefit from democratic, level playing field, innovative capitalism. So I think that eventually you're going to see a pushback from those sectors, as you're starting to see in the US today. And I that moving forward, the argument vis-a-vis the wealthy and the entitled and the beneficiary of either right-wing or left-wing populism has to be that you need to make the pie bigger and distribute it better, because otherwise you're going to end up with leaders like Trump or like López Obrador, who may be your friends in the short term and provide you with economic benefits via discretionary policy initially, but in the long term, you're going to end up with a much less prosperous society, with a much smaller consumer base, with greater divisions, and possibly political and social instability. So I think here is where the art of persuasion regarding this idea of saving capitalism from the capitalists and helping them understand that some sort of new deal is required that is more inclusive, that will entail higher taxation and probably more regulation for them. But in the end, everyone will be better off.
Great. I know that we're coming to the end of the hour, but I do want to at least take one more question, and then afterwards we'll break into small groups to make sure we will continue to engage with each other, including me and some of the speakers. But let's hear from Michael next. Michael, go ahead.
Hi. So Denise, you're talking about, so you brought up identity politics, kind of, on both sides, and there's this interesting thing where, and I was reading in David Frum's book, and it seemed a little bit facetious when he said this, but now it's kind of started to seem a little bit real. But he said something about how this new nationalism on the right, but it's not really talking about the American nation with a capital in DC, but he said it was a multinational white race with a capital in Moscow. It sounded really like a huge exaggeration, or it's almost like a joke or something, but then you let that sink in for a while and you see these really subtle things, are people in Puerto Rico, are they citizens? I mean, does the president it seems like there's really subtle cues or really subtle things like, well, let's just do something to make it kind of feel like they're not citizens or treat them in a different way, right? Or let's say people in our own country need supplies for COVID, and then let's just send some over to, I mean, it's not like it wasn't a huge amount that he sent over, but it was just enough to send a queue, and just enough that when I'm talking about it here, or when we're talking about it, like I sound like a crazy conspiracy theorist. So that way people on the right can see that and say, oh, we're just all crazy, right? But it's just enough, it seems like there's just enough subtle cues to make it so that when we talk about it, we sound crazy, but you know what I'm saying?
I disagree with you. I don't think the clues are subtle at all. I think they are just so obvious. I think
maybe they're not. I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, you saw them in Charlottesville, you saw them at the rally in Tulsa, you saw them with all of the restrictions to immigration, you saw them with to limit visas for international students for universities that were only going to return online. You see it almost every day in the way in which he refers to Latinos, to Mexicans, and so there is an emphasis, or I'd say a clear-cut position on the part of the Trump administration that legitimate citizens are white people, and that everybody else is sort of questionable. And it's not clear whether they're going to have equal rights, whether their rights will be taken away. And that's why you see restrictions on voting, you see restrictions on the rights of women, and so many other signals that to me are not at all subtle. I think they're very obvious. And that's the way in which he won the presidency and the way in which he tends to mobilize his base.
So I have a kind of view on this, which is that one of the responses to critiques of identity politics has been, well, what about whites? Isn't Donald Trump playing white identity politics all of the time? I think that's right insofar as it goes. I think absolutely Donald Trump is playing white identity politics. I agree both with sort of Michael carefully wanting to say it and with Denise saying it more outright. I think that's absolutely true. Now, The question is, does that seem to us like a good model to emulate? There's something slightly strange about the defender of identity politics saying, well, everybody has identity politics. Look at Trump, he has identity politics. That doesn't seem to me like a great reason to do something that's an equivalent of it, or a kind of copy of it, even though it's more legitimate to fight for the group interests of groups that have historically been suppressed and oppressed and underrepresented, rather than those that already are sort of at the top of society. But nevertheless, I think it should make us think that if actually Trump is doing form of identity politics too, perhaps we shouldn't really be doing a different version of it. That might not be the most serious thought about how we can actually build a better society. So I just want to end by hearing from Ivan and Pratap about how they think about those questions of identity in their societies. There's obviously forms of right-wing identity politics in those societies too. That's certainly, to my mind, what Narendra Modi and what people like Viktor Orban or Jaroslaw Kaczynski are doing. What is the right response to that? How can we build a national identity, a national community that is better able to stand up to that misuse of identity politics on the right without importing some of the negative aspects of the kind of left-wing identity politics that is increasingly rising in the United States? Ivan and Pratap.
Yeah, thank you very much. For sure. And as I said, there is a very important demographic element in this, because normally majorities were not so much kind of concerned about rights because they believe that democracy works for them. The rights was for minorities. And this is what people, and then suddenly certain type of a majority group starts to fear that because of demographic reasons in 20, 30 years, they're not going to be a majority anymore. So if you talk about the project of people like Orban or Kaczynski, the story is the following. They know that they're going to open their societies because of the market pressure. If you listen basically to what the Polish government speaks, you're going to believe that not a single migrant has entered the country. But the reality is that Poland is the European Union member states that welcome most labor migrants for the last 3 years. It is Ukrainians, almost 2 million going there because the Polish market needs them. So what you're going to see with this identity politics is two things. First, very cultural approach to whom you want to allow to enter your country. And secondly, divorce between the political and the economic. You can come and work, but you're not going to vote. You're not going to give citizenship to these people. You're trying to keep the ethnic nature of the body politics while at the same time opening the market. And I find this extremely kind of a risky, because also seeing the average age of these ethnic groups in 30 years, you can end up with a situation in which 1/3 of the working people are not going to have the right to vote. And 40% of the voters are not working anymore because they're retired people. And this kind of a divorce between politics and economics could be extremely, extremely difficult. And paradoxically, even the fact that we're a member of the European Union makes it easier, because people said, listen, okay, you don't have a citizenship here, but you have a citizenship in your own country. Why do you want to vote here? You're living in Austria, why don't you vote in Bulgaria anyway? So I do believe this is going to be a major issue. And when you say what is the answer, I don't believe that there is a universal answer. I don't believe that what we should do in Poland is the same that you're going to do in Mexico, or the same in the United States. So we can have a common conversations, which in my view are very important because they're common features. But when it comes to the political strategies, it's really important to be very much contextual, to be very much based on certain type of particular experiences that people have. And from this point of view, having more cultural sensitivities on the side of the liberals and not basically going into the business of exporting solutions, in my view, is not going to hurt.
Well, sometimes I'm going to make a bad attempt at a Krastevianism here. Krastevism, I don't know what the right term is. But perhaps an elegant and slightly simplistic definition of a liberal is somebody who can appreciate every culture in the world other than their own. And that can be a problem for liberals. Pratap.
So let me try a different version of whatever Krastevism, not that elegant, but and I think this is prompted by something Trevor said, which is, and since this is like my first participation in persuasion and this project, is I do think liberals have to be a little bit careful about not pretending to know the answer to a question before the question has been asked. And that, on the one hand, I think we need to make a distinction between saying, look, there are certain core values we defend, right? We defend human rights, we defend freedom of expression, we defend a whole range of values, right? But I think what we have been less good at, and I think it was reflected actually in the liberal institutions, right, that we created are, there's a friend of mine, Amit Chaudhry, the great writer, who says, East Coast liberalism's, the best set of institutions a lot of money can buy, the New York Review of Books, the New York Times. You would never have guessed what the world is like if you had actually read those institutions. So when we are talking about, and why this is relevant to identity politics, is that it seems to be there are two kinds of identity politics, just to make a very simplistic distinction, right? One, which is in a sense, basically trying to exclude certain groups from enjoying privileges. So majorities versus minorities, ideologies of supremacy and domination. And then there are invocations of identity, where the purpose is not to preserve the identity. The purpose is, in a sense, to recognize it so that it can be included in whatever this kind of larger project is. And I think we've not, in a sense, been very good at listening sharply to what the impediments to those inclusions have been. I think that those are actually our allies in some ways, right? So I think that and not fall into the majoritarian identity trap of sort of, because it's the wicket they want us to bat on, right? Identity politics versus identity politics. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing, which I think is important again in the spirit of liberalism, right, is it's the point that Denise made about the relationship between liberalism and democracy, which is look, at the end of the day, democracy is the art of building sustainable political coalitions, right? You've got to win elections. You've actually got to think of politics seriously. And politics in the very quotidian sense. Politics means leaders. Politics means dealing with differences. Politics means a certain kind of grammar of articulation and organization. And I think there is a sense that because we liberals sort of just tend to throw, right, rights and procedures as answers to those difficult questions, we are perceived as anti-political in some senses, right? And I think, Yasha, you also made this point on many occasions, right? That in a sense, what we need to find is a new breed of politicians who are both not embarrassed to be liberal, but in a sense who can do the work of politics, which is the work of social mediation. Politics is a play of different groups, different points of view. And it has to work through democracy in some ways, rather than simply go and say, look, here's an answer, that we have. And the third and the final thing about identity politics, which is that it partly depends how much you see identity politics as cause and how much of you see it as a symptom, right? So one of the criticisms of liberal politics has been that because politics had been reduced to a kind of bipartisan consensus on economic policy within 2 degrees of right and 2 degrees of left, mostly managed by technocratic regulators, that actually left the political space open in some senses for it being reconfigured around these, in a sense, identity dimensions, right? And if you think about creative ways of linking issues around inequality that Denise talked about, economic growth in very different ways, you will probably find that the burden that is being placed on identity politics to create coalitions, right? The left try to do it to the multicultural coalition, that's the allegation at least. And the right tries to do it through majoritarian supremacist coalitions. The only way of kind of breaking that is to, in a sense, see people as much more complexly embedded in these structures of power and economic articulation, and be a lot more intelligent about how we mobilize them.
Well, listen, this is exactly the sort of debate that I hope we would be having when we founded this community. So for all of those of you watching, please do go to www.persuasion.community. in order to sign up to get our articles and pieces, but also to find out about future debates like that. So now it just remains for me to do two things. First of all, to give a very, very big thank you to these three wonderful members of our board of advisors, Denise Dresser, Ivan Krastev, and Pratap Bhanu Mehta. And finally, to invite everybody who is part of a Zoom call to drop the call if you've had enough and you have a nice Sunday and you have to go and have lunch or meet some friends. But if you want to stay behind and discuss with some of us this conversation and your own ideas about it or anything else that's on your mind, feel free to stay behind. And we're going to be putting everybody into small groups in a minute in order to do that. Thank you very much to everybody for watching and see you at our next event at Persuasion.
Thank you, Yasha. Thanks.